The advertisement Jonah Sterling placed in the San Francisco Chronicle had been brutally practical: wife wanted. Sober man with freight business in Nevada seeks practical woman of good character for marriage. No poets or dreamers. Fair paid. He had imagined someone sturdy, weathered, and uncomplaining. He had prepared himself for a companion who was more of a partner in labor than in life. But when the stagecoach creaked to a halt in the dusty main street of Argenta, the woman who stepped down was not what he had envisioned. She was small, almost bird-like, and clutched a single, worn cloth bundle. Her name, the matchmaker's letter had said, was My Lynn. She was 25 years old, orphaned, and seeking a respectable life far from the crowded alleys of the city. The letter had called her plain, and Jonah supposed she was. Her face was a quiet, unadorned oval, her eyes dark and watchful, revealing nothing. She did not look sturdy. She looked like a gust of wind might carry her off. Jonah, a man whose reputation was built on a foundation of quiet competence and an unspoken capacity for violence, felt a strange and unwelcome flicker of something akin to pity. It was a useless emotion. He had made a bargain. He nodded curtly, the dust from the street swirling around his worn boots. "Miss Lynn." "I'm Jonah Sterling." Her eyes met his for a moment before dropping to the ground. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible bow. "Mr. Sterling," she said. Her voice was softer than he expected, the English words carefully formed but hesitant. He took her bundle, which weighed next to nothing, and led her toward the small clapboard house at the edge of town, next to the corrals and sheds of his freight business. The house was as brutally practical as his advertisement. It had a main room with a cold stove, a table, and 2 chairs. 2 smaller rooms branched off it. It was clean, but it was the sterile, empty clean of a place that had never been a home. He had swept it out that morning, a futile gesture against the persistent Nevada dust that coated every surface. "This is it," he said, setting her bundle on the table. "Your room is there." He gestured to one of the doors. "I'll get the stove going." The first night was an exercise in awkward silence. He cooked what he always cooked, fried salt pork and beans from a can, washed down with bitter coffee. He ate quickly, his gaze fixed on his plate. She picked at her food, her movements precise and delicate. He wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. This was not a woman built for the harsh realities of a frontier town. The next day, he left at dawn to haul a load of mining equipment to a claim up in the hills. He left coin on the table for supplies, along with a short list: flour, beans, bacon, coffee. When he returned that evening, bone-weary and coated in a thick layer of grime, a scent met him at the door. It was not the familiar smell of wood smoke and dust. It was something else entirely, something warm and complex that made his stomach clench with a hunger he hadn't realized he possessed. He stepped inside. The table was set for 2. In the center sat a platter of something he couldn't name. It was pieces of chicken, brown to perfection, glistening in a dark, savory sauce with slivers of onion and some kind of wild mushroom he'd seen growing by the creek but never thought to eat. There was a bowl of fluffy rice and a plate of greens, cooked until just tender. The air was thick with the aroma of ginger and garlic, scents so foreign to his plain existence they felt like an intrusion from another world. My Lynn stood by the stove, her expression as unreadable as ever. She watched him, waiting. He sat down slowly, his body protesting the movement. He served himself, the weight of the serving spoon unfamiliar in his hand. He took a bite. The chicken was tender, the sauce a perfect balance of salt and a subtle, unfamiliar sweetness. It was, without exaggeration, the best thing he had ever tasted in his entire life. He ate the entire plate without speaking, then a second. He looked up at her, his throat tight with a confusion he couldn't articulate. She had taken the coins he left and gone to the general store. But she hadn't just bought the items on his list. She had bought a scrawny chicken, some onions, and a few other things with the leftover change. She had transformed his grim, functional kitchen into a place of impossible alchemy. He cleared his throat. "This is good." For the first time, a flicker of something shifted in her eyes. It wasn't a smile, not quite. It was a quiet acknowledgement, the look of an artist who knows her work is appreciated. From that day on, everything changed. Jonah Sterling, a man who had survived on hardtack and bitter coffee for years, began to live for dinner time. He found himself making excuses to come back from his runs earlier. He started paying more attention at the general store, noticing which vegetables looked freshest, buying cuts of meat he'd never considered before. He'd leave them on the counter without a word, and in the evening, they would be transformed into something miraculous. The town of Argenta began to notice a change in him. He'd always been a solitary figure, respected out of a healthy dose of fear. Men knew he'd been a gunslinger, that he'd left a trail of bodies in Arizona before seeking a quieter life. He never spoke of it, but the way he wore his Colt, low and tied down, spoke for him. He was not a man to be trifled with. But now, a different kind of story began to circulate. He seemed less grim, the hard lines around his eyes softening. The trouble started, as it often did in Argenta, with a man named Franklin Barrett. Barrett owned the saloon, the hotel, and held the deed on half the businesses in town. He was a man who liked to have everyone in his debt, and he saw Jonah's independence as a quiet challenge. Barrett decided it was time to bring Sterling into his fold. He cornered Jonah outside the assayer's office one afternoon. "Sterling," he said, his voice a smooth, confident purr. "I'm having a few of the town's leading men over for dinner at the hotel on Saturday. A discussion about the new railroad spur. You should be there." It was not an invitation, it was a summons. To decline was to signal that you were not on Barrett's team. Jonah thought of the bland, greasy steak and boiled potatoes that passed for fine dining at the hotel. Then he thought of the fragrant, steaming bowls My Lin placed on his table each night. "Thank you for the offer, Barrett," Jonah said, his voice even. "But I'll be eating at home." Barrett's smile tightened. "My cook is one of the best in the territory. It's an important meeting." "I'm sure it is," Jonah replied, turning to leave. "But my wife's cooking suits me better." The refusal hit the small town like a thrown stone. It was a public slight. Barrett was not a man who tolerated public slights. The story twisted as it was retold in the saloon. Sterling was too good for the town's food. He was holed up with his foreign wife, thinking he was better than everyone else. The whispers grew uglier. That she had him under some kind of spell. A few days later, two of Barrett's men, rough-looking freight handlers who worked for a rival outfit, showed up at Jonah's corrals. They leaned against the fence, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. Sterling, the bigger one, called out. "Mr. Barrett was mighty disappointed you didn't join him for supper. He thinks maybe you're getting unsociable." Jonah didn't stop his work, methodically checking the harness on one of his draft horses. "I'm a busy man." "Too busy for your neighbors," the second man sneered. "Or is it just that you prefer that slop your little China doll cooks up?" Jonah's hand stilled. He turned slowly, his eyes as cold and gray as a winter sky. He didn't reach for his gun. He didn't need to. The stillness in him was more threatening than any sudden movement. "What I eat in my own home is my business. What you just said is yours. I'd advise you to take your business elsewhere." The men shifted, suddenly aware that they had crossed a line. They had come to intimidate, but they found themselves facing a quiet certainty that promised lethal consequences. From the window of the house, My Lin watched, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She saw the coiled danger in her husband, the reason the whole town gave him a wide berth. The men muttered something under their breath and backed away, disappearing down the dusty track. Jonah watched them go, a muscle twitching in his jaw. He had come to Argenta to escape this kind of trouble, to bury the man he had been. But the man waiting on his porch was not who she expected. He did not yet know that the deed in his pocket was not the only thing he was hiding. He looked back at the house and saw her silhouette in the window. He realized with a jolt that his simple, practical arrangement had become complicated. Her secret skill had drawn a line in the sand, and he had just chosen his side. He had no idea what that choice would truly cost him. That evening, the silence in the small house was heavier than usual. The meal was a simple noodle soup, but the aroma was just as rich, the broth complex and warming. Jonah ate, his mind replaying the confrontation at the corral. He had defended his right to eat at his own table, but in doing so, he had put My Lin at the center of a conflict she had not asked for. He looked at her across the table. Her face, as always, was a calm mask, but he could see the tension in the set of her shoulders. After the meal, as she was clearing the plates, he spoke. His voice was low, cutting through the quiet. "You should have told me." She paused, her back to him. "Told you what, Mr. Sterling?" "That you could cook like this," he said. It sounded foolish as soon as he said it. It wasn't about the food, not really. It was about the secrets they both kept. "This trouble with Barrett, it's because of me. Because I insulted him. But they're using you to get at me." She turned, her dark eyes meeting his. For the first time, he saw not placid obedience, but a profound and weary strength. "They do not know me," she said softly. "They only see my face. My cooking, it is the only thing I have that is mine." He leaned forward, his forearms on the rough-hewn table. "I don't know you either, My Lin. You arrive here with nothing but a bundle of clothes, and you can cook better than any chef in a San Francisco hotel. Why are you here? Why marry a man you've never met, in a town like this?" She was silent for a long moment, her gaze dropping to her hands, which were clasped tightly on the wooden countertop. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, but it filled the small room with the weight of her history. "My father was a cook," she began. "He worked for a rich American family in the city. He taught me everything. How to choose vegetables, how to balance flavors, how to make a feast from almost nothing. It was our life. It was a happy time." She paused, and the memory seemed to cause her a physical pain. "But he was a gambler. He owed money to a man, a powerful man in our community named Mr. Chen. When my father died from a fever, the debt became mine." Jonah remained perfectly still, listening. He knew about men like Chen, men who operated in the shadows, whose power was absolute within their own circles. "Mr. Chen did not want money," she continued, her voice trembling slightly. "He wanted me. He owns a house, a place for women. I was to be sold into his service to pay my father's debt. I had no one. No family to protect me." She took a ragged breath. "The matchmaker was my only escape. She knew a man in Argenta needed a wife. She used my dowry money to pay for my passage, to tell Mr. Chen I had gone to visit family in the East. She gave me a chance to disappear. To be a plain, quiet wife to a man who wanted nothing more than a housekeeper." She looked up at him, and for the first time, he saw the desperation she had hidden so well. "I cook because it is all I have left of my father. It is the one part of my life that Mr. Chen cannot touch. When I am in this kitchen, I am not a debtor. I am not a frightened orphan. I am my father's daughter." The confession settled between them, reframing everything. He had seen their arrangement as a simple contract, a transaction for mutual convenience. But for her, it had been a desperate fight for her life and her honor. He had been her shield, a wall of anonymity in a dusty Nevada town. But now, his own reputation was cracking that wall, drawing the very attention she had run so far to escape. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not a plain, quiet woman, but a survivor of immense courage. His respect for her, which had begun with a plate of chicken, deepened into something far more profound. "Your secret is safe with me, My Lin," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't name. "This is your home. No one will bother you here." But Barrett was not a man to be deterred by a simple warning. His business depended on his reputation for control. He couldn't let Sterling's defiance go unanswered. He began to apply pressure in other ways. A shipment of Jonah's was mysteriously delayed, the goods damaged. The blacksmith suddenly became too busy to shoe his horses. Whispers about Jonah's violent past in Arizona grew louder, painting him not as a man who had defended himself, but as a cold-blooded killer looking for his next victim. Then, the true danger arrived. A finely dressed Chinese man stepped off the afternoon stage, flanked by two large, impassive bodyguards. He moved with an air of cold authority, his silk tunic a stark contrast to the town's dusty work clothes. He asked for Franklin Barrett. They met in the back room of the saloon. The man introduced himself as Mr. Chen. A mutual acquaintance in San Francisco, a man Barrett owed a favor to, had suggested that if Chen was looking for a runaway debtor, a woman named Lin, he might find her in Argenta. Barrett, seeing a perfect opportunity to rid himself of Jonah Sterling, confirmed that the woman was indeed there, married to a troublesome gunslinger. That evening, as Jonah was unhitching his team, Mr. Chen and his men approached. Jonah's hand instinctively dropped to the butt of his Colt. "Mr. Sterling," Chen said, his English perfect and clipped. He smiled, but it was a cold, predatory expression. "I believe you have something that belongs to me. A woman. Her name is Mai Lin. She is a debtor who fled my city. I have come to collect her." Jonah stood between the men and his front door, a solid, unmoving obstacle. "She is my wife. She belongs to no 1 inch. A marriage of convenience, I am sure," Chen said dismissively. "It can be annulled. I am prepared to be generous. I will compensate you for your trouble and the fare you paid for her passage." He was talking about Mai Lin as if she were a piece of lost cargo. From inside the house, Mai Lin heard the voices. She peeked through the curtains, and her blood ran cold. It was him. The man from her nightmares was standing in her front yard. "She's not for sale," Jonah said, his voice dangerously low. "This conversation is over. Get off my property." Chen's smile vanished. "You are making a grave mistake, Mr. Sterling. You are a man of reputation, I hear. A man who understands violence. So you must understand that I will not leave Argenta without what is mine." He turned and walked away, his bodyguards falling into step behind him. The threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The letter arrived 3 days later. It was not signed. Jonah knew he was at a crossroads. He could give Mai Lin money and send her away on the next stage, let her try to run again. It would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing. It would end his trouble with Barrett and remove the threat of Chen. He could go back to his simple, solitary life. But the thought of his house without the warm, savory smells, without her quiet, steady presence, left a hollow ache in his chest. He thought of her story, of her courage. He had offered her a home, and a home was not something you abandoned when trouble came knocking. He walked into the kitchen where she was preparing the evening meal, her hands moving with practiced grace. She did not look up, but he knew she was aware of his presence, of the decision that lay before them. "Mai Lin," he said. She finally looked at him, her eyes wide with fear and resignation. "I will pack my things." "No," he said, the word coming out with more force than he intended. "You'll do no such thing." He walked to the stove and looked into the pot. A rich, dark stew was simmering, filling the room with a comforting aroma. "You're going to cook dinner? A big one? The best one you've ever made?" She stared at him, confused. "What?" "I'm inviting some guests," he said, a grim plan forming in his mind. "Mr. Chen. Mr. Barrett. And the town marshal. We're going to settle this. Right here. At our table." He was not going to fight them in the street like a common thug. He was not going to let them drag him back into the life he'd left behind. He was going to face them in his home, on his terms, and he was going to use the very thing they had targeted as his weapon, his wife's gift. He would show them all that this was not a house of secrets and spells, but the home of a man who would protect his own. The air in Jonah's small house was thick with the scent of roasted duck and ginger, a fragrant challenge to the tension tightening the room. Marshal Thompson, a portly man who preferred peace to justice, sat uncomfortably at the head of the table. To his right sat Franklin Barrett, his face a mask of smug satisfaction. To his left, Mr. Chen watched everything with the cool, appraising gaze of a viper. Jonah sat opposite the marshal, his chair angled slightly away from the table, his right hand resting casually on his thigh, inches from his Colt. My Lin moved with a quiet, deliberate grace, placing platters on the table. There was the roasted duck with a glistening, dark glaze, a heaping bowl of noodles tossed with crisp vegetables, delicate steamed fish, and a platter of savory pork dumplings. It was a feast, an act of defiant artistry in the face of imminent threat. She worked without looking at any of the men, her focus entirely on her task. But Jonah could feel the tremor in her hands as she set a bowl of rice before him. For a time, no one spoke. The sheer quality of the food was disarming. Marshall Thompson, a man who appreciated his meals, tucked in with gusto. Even Barrett and Chen, after a moment's hesitation, served themselves. The silence was broken only by the clink of forks and chopsticks. Finally, Barrett wiped his mouth with a napkin. "Well, Sterling," he said, his voice oozing false cordiality. "I must admit, your wife has a certain talent. A shame to keep it all to yourself." "What I keep to myself is my own affair," Jonah said, his eyes never leaving Barrett's. He had not touched his food. "But since you're all here, let's make some things public. Mr. Chen, you've come a long way from San Francisco. You claim my wife is your property." Chen dabbed his lips delicately. "A business matter, nothing more. A debt is a debt." "And you, Barrett," Jonah continued, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous pitch. "You had no trouble pointing him here. I imagine you thought he'd solve a problem for you. Get me out of your way so you can continue to squeeze this town dry." Marshall Thompson put his fork down, his face paling. "Now, Jonah, let's keep this civil." "It stopped being civil when he sent his men to my home," Jonah said, nodding toward Barrett. "And it stopped being civil when this man showed up to claim my wife like a stray horse." He pushed his chair back slightly. "Here's how this is going to be. My Lin is my wife. This is her home. She owes you nothing, Chen. Any debt her father had died with him. In this territory, a woman is not her father's property, and she is not her husband's. And she sure as hell is not chattel for a loan shark from San Francisco." Chen's eyes narrowed. "You are interfering in something you don't understand." "I understand perfectly," Jonah shot back. "And Marshall, you need to understand this. Mr. Chen is in the business of human trafficking. He buys and sells people. That is against territorial law. And Mr. Barrett here is an accomplice." Barrett slammed his hand on the table. "That's a lie. I have no part in this man's business." "Don't you?" Jonah asked softly. "You sent word to your associates in San Francisco. You told them where to find her. You conspired to have a citizen of this town, a married woman, abducted. I wonder how the territorial judge would feel about that." The room fell silent. Jonah was bluffing, but he delivered it with the cold certainty of a man holding a winning hand. He was using the law, a weapon they did not expect him to wield. He had turned their private intimidation into a public legal matter, right in front of the town's chief lawman. Marshall Thompson looked from Chen's cold fury to Barrett's panicked face. He was not a brave man, but he was not a fool. He knew which way the wind was blowing. He cleared his throat, his authority returning. "Mr. Chen, I think it's time you told me exactly what your business is in my town. And Barrett, you and I will have a long talk in my office tomorrow morning." Chen stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. He looked at Jonah, his face a mask of cold hatred. But the threat was gone, replaced by the bitter taste of defeat. He and his men were escorted out by the marshal. Barrett was left sitting at the table, his face ashen. He looked at Jonah, then at the remnants of the magnificent feast, and seemed to finally understand the depth of his miscalculation. He had tried to break Jonah Sterling, but had only succeeded in showing the entire town what the man was willing to fight for. 6 months passed. The winter snows melted from the peaks, and the high desert bloomed with spring wildflowers. Argenta was changing. Franklin Barrett, his reputation tarnished and his influence broken, had sold the hotel and saloon and moved on. Mr. Chen was never seen in Nevada again. And the Sterling household had changed most of all. Jonah's freight business was prospering, but it was now their second venture. The front room of their small house had been converted. It now held for simple, sturdy tables. A hand-painted sign hung out front, "The Sterling House. Meals served." It had started small, with a few miners and freight drivers who had heard the stories. They came for the food, and they left as converts. Soon, it was the only place anyone wanted to eat. My Lynn's kitchen, once her private sanctuary, was now the heart of the town. She was no longer the strange, silent foreigner. She was Mrs. Sterling, the woman who had brought flavors to Argenta that no one had ever dreamed of. She hired a woman from town to help her, and her hesitant English grew more confident every day. One evening, after the last customer had left, Jonah sat at one of the tables, watching her. The room was quiet, filled with the lingering, comforting smells of cooked food and the soft clatter of my Lynn cleaning her kitchen. He was no longer just the man the town feared, he was my Lynn's husband, the co-proprietor of the best eatery in the county. She came out of the kitchen and set a small bowl of sweet red bean soup in front of him, a treat she only made for him. She sat down across from him, the weariness of a long day in her posture, but a soft contentment in her eyes. "It was a good day," she said. He nodded, taking a spoonful of the soup. It was warm and sweet. He looked around the room they had built together, at the life they had forged from a desperate bargain and a shared meal. He had sent for a practical wife and found a partner. He had sought a quiet life and found a home. The gunslinger who had once refused all town food had discovered that the only thing worth fighting for was a place at his own table, with the woman who had made it a feast. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.